Hello, and welcome to Understanding Transitional Justice. Our topic for this week is collective memory and collective guilt. And I'm going to do something a little bit different this week with the video presentation, and that is rather than giving you different segments where I explain different things, this is a topic really on which I generally don't lecture. It's more of a discussion topic than a lecture topic. So I am going to raise some categories and refer to some literature, but basically I am raising questions. So I'm going to raise questions and I'm going to record this all in one sitting. So you're going to get slightly less time in terms of lecturing than you get in most weeks, and it's all going to be in one video file that will probably be longer than your average video file. But I think this makes more sense than trying to come up with artificial ways of dividing the topic. So when we talk about guilt, I think it's important to understand what is meant by guilt, and let me offer you a framework for developing typologies of guilt. And this framework comes from the German philosopher Karl Jaspers, who at the end of World War II publishes his well-known work on the question of German guilt. And he is trying to answer the question, trying to address typical citizens of Germany and answer the question of how guilty they ought to feel about the events that many of them are finding out about just at the end of the war. And what he says is that there are different types of guilt, and he divides guilt into four types. The types that he offers is first what he calls simple guilt. Now, simple guilt is pretty much an equivalent to what guilt would be in a legal setting. That is, this is the guilt of somebody who has committed an offense and is found guilty of that offense, and so they are responsible for what they did. What is important about simple guilt is that it applies only to the person who committed the crime. Now, when you move into larger categories, a question is raised that ends up being a very important one, and that is it appropriate for people to carry guilt or to feel guilty for something that they have not done themselves, for something that other people have done? And Jasper's answer to the question is, possibly surprisingly, yes. And he says there are three ways in which the answer to the question is yes. He says, first of all, look at the second item here on the slide. There is the category of political guilt. And what political guilt implies is that everybody exists as a member of a community. And being a member of a community is a status that carries with it obligations, and it carries with it consequences. So when decisions are made by a political collective, then responsibilities are imposed on every person in the collective, and there are consequences for everybody in the collective. And this is regardless of whether every individual in the collective supported this decision or not. If you want to give a trivial example, you may have any of a variety of opinions about taxation, whether there should be any taxation or not, whether it should be high or low, whether it should apply to certain groups or not. This is your view, your opinion that you hold on an individual level. However, once the law is passed that determines what the rate is of taxation, then that is the amount that you owe. Similarly, if the collective of which you are a member commits an act for which there are consequences like sanctions, damage to reputation, similar things, you are going to carry those consequences whether you agree with the decision to take that action or the action that was taken or not. So everybody, because they are members of communities, carry some level of political guilt. Jaspers asks, are there any exceptions to this? People who do not carry political guilt because they are not members of collectives. And the examples that he is able to come up with, there are examples like hermits, monks, for example. The next category of guilt that could be thought of as collective is moral guilt. And fundamentally, what this category is designed to address is the defense that somebody was following orders. That is, that their guilt or their obedience or their tolerance of evil was not the result of their decision, but of decisions that were made by somebody else. And Jaspers argues in response to this, says everybody has to answer to moral imperatives and to their own moral values. So the fact that a decision to do something was made by somebody else does not relieve every individual in a community of the obligation to make the decision of whether they are going to go along with that or not. So every member of a community has moral responsibility for decisions that are made in that community, again, whether they supported them or not, whether they took part in making those decisions or not. And finally, the broadest category that Jaspers comes up with is what he calls metaphysical guilt. And metaphysical guilt derives from the fact that we are human. And he argues all humans are obligated to know about, all humans have feelings about, all humans share a measure of responsibility for everything that happens in the community of human beings. So this is why he calls it metaphysical. He says, regardless of particular circumstances, we all have an obligation to act in a way that is correct and ethical and proper. Now, these are the four categories of guilt that are laid out by Karl Jaspers. What I think we might want to argue is that only one of these categories really involves guilt, the way that it's commonly understood. And that's the first one, simple guilt, which is equivalent to criminal guilt. The rest of the categories that he offers might be better thought of as responsibility than as guilt. That is, they relate to the fact that we are compelled to live lives within communities and that we have obligations to those communities. And in the broader sense, we have obligations of as human beings. There is another fact that is probably worth keeping in mind anytime that you see categories like this, and that is that we do not live lives and we do not live in an environment where things fit neatly into the kinds of categories that are developed in philosophy and in theory. The world is messy, it is complex, it is contradictory. We generally do not know, very often cannot clearly know, what everybody's feelings and motivations are. What I think we might be able to derive from this proposal made by Karl Jaspers in the middle range is a modest moral proposition. Given what we know, we should try to respond as ethically as we can. But what we know and how we respond are not necessarily certainties. These things are not given. You'll see in the last couple of sentences that I gave you there, I used the word know quite a lot. When we talk about knowledge, we bring up the category of collective memory. And we can ask, is there such a thing as collective memory? I'd say as a psychological proposition, there is probably not. That is, any person in their brain will remember the things that they remember, and these are not necessarily shared by other people, but there are social institutions and practices that encourage a certain sort of memory. The teaching of history, the telling of stories, the sharing of values, of family experience, or of the experiences of larger groups, including ethnic and national groups. What this implies is that there's implicitly some kind of obligation of people who are members of a community, members of a collective, to know something. This is what we would describe as collective memory. There is an expectation that members of the same collective will have at least some basic elements of knowledge in common. But this is a proposition that raises more questions than it answers, because if we postulate that there is an obligation to know, we have to ask the question, how widely diffused is the obligation to know? Is this an obligation that applies only to people holding power within a collective, or is it an obligation that applies to every member of a collective? And if it applies to every member of a collective, how much are they obligated to know? Are they obligated to have detailed knowledge? And what do we do then? What is the proper response to people who do not know things? And how do we characterize lack of knowledge? It's entirely possible for people to not know things unintentionally. They didn't teach it, they haven't learned it, they do other things, they have the rest of their life. But lack of knowledge can also be deliberate on the part of individuals, or it can be deliberate on the part of a collective, that there is a decision not to teach, to maintain silence about certain subjects or to misrepresent certain subjects. And when we talk about people who do not know, what moral valence do we attach to the fact of not knowing something? What do people who do not know things think, or is there anything that we can postulate that they think at all? Now, why do we raise this in the context of post-conflict justice? Maybe one way into this is by looking at the research on post-conflict memory in Serbia by Jelena Obradović, who approaches the often stated hypothesis that knowledge and communication and dialogue about events of the violence of the 1990s in the former Yugoslavia is absent. And she says, well, maybe it is absent from a lot of forms of public discourse. But if you look at private conversations, the kinds of conversations that happen in families, among friends and acquaintances, communication and dialogue do happen, but they don't happen in this kind of systematic and formulaic way that we might like to suppose. There are constraints on communication, and a good deal of communication is interpreted through private rather than public ways. This is especially the case in situations where public institutions are not involved. So what may be very important in understanding memory and the relation between memory and talk about memory is that we need to understand what the things are that are not said and the reasons that the things that are not said, why people do not say the things that they do not say. That is to say, we need to go a lot deeper than just looking at things like the content of political speeches or the content of media. This is as much as I will say about collective memory and shared knowledge. Let me move on to a touchier topic, collective guilt. Now, let me say in the beginning, as a moral proposition, the suggestion that something like collective guilt exists sounds like nonsense. People cannot feel guilty and very often not responsible for something that somebody else did. But is it really nonsense? It might be thought of not just as nonsense, but as useful nonsense, in that it permits actual criminals to hide behind the mask of a community, to say that a community is innocent and therefore I am innocent, or that charges about my guilt are really charges about the guilt of a community. And isn't it also the case that we very often have feelings of collective guilt or collective responsibility in relation to the histories of our communities, in relation to the history of things like imperialism, the slave trade, different historical events that affected different communities? Do these place obligations on contemporary members of these same communities who had nothing directly to do with these acts? It's a political question, but you can probably see when many of the reasons why people might answer yes to this question. Now, here I want to draw a distinction between collective guilt and collective responsibility. That is to say, it is possible that historical events may impose responsibilities on communities, may be a source of obligation to communities, without having to assume that any particular members of communities are complicit in or involved with those historical events. And there are forms of collective guilt that we are probably familiar with. Demands for acknowledgement of the experience of some groups, collective punishment of some groups in the form of sanctions, demands for compensation, or in the case of a lot of historical accounts, accounts that make a demand for coming to terms with the past, as the jargon has it, the promotion of guilty sentiment. Now, suppose that the promotion of guilty sentiment is successful, and a lot of people feel then guilty about something that was done by the ethnic or national community of which they are a member, imperialism, a genocide, slavery, whatever. What happens then? What is the effect of people feeling guilty? We do have some research on this, and a lot of this research comes especially from the research by Sabina Cehajic, a researcher based in Sarajevo, who is looking at historical memory and the effects of guilt associated with historical memory. And here's one of the things that her research comes up with. She says, to the degree that familiarity with facts from the historical past promote feelings of guilt and shame, these feelings tend to contribute to increased tolerance and to increased willingness to make reparations toward groups who are victims. Now here I want to move to talk about one of the authors whose work we asked you to look at for this week, and that is Elazar Barkan. Now, Barkan offers a proposal on making restitution to affected communities as an element of morality. Let me give you a warning about Barkan's writing. That is, it's safe to pass over a lot of what he has to say about the history of Enlightenment philosophy and so on. That's a contribution to a different debate. But here's where he's going with his argument. He's asking the big question: why is it that democratic societies, most of the time, tend to generally reject both far-right extremism and religious fundamentalism? What is it that that makes them, at their cores, essentially moderate in orientation? And he argues, well, this comes from an understanding of historical experience, and it's an understanding of historical experience that doesn't take the form of collective guilt, but something more like responsibility. It takes the form of shared obligation, and that in a democratic environment there is, or should be, or often is, or perhaps not often enough is, an understanding that the whole of society benefits from upholding the principle of equality, from the recognition of all groups and all experiences. And so the core of public ethics involves sharing feeling and sharing sentiment across groups, the promotion of recognition and understanding. Now, how does this relate to the propositions about collective guilt and collective responsibility? I think what Barkan wants to imply is this, that feelings or expressed feelings of guilt or responsibility, these can be promoted in a number of ways, but they are only meaningful if they're adopted voluntarily. That is, if they are an expression of ethical postures and ethical orientations that are genuinely shared in a community, and they only have consequences if they're applied directly, if they work in recognition of the local context in which they're developed, if they relate the universal values that are expressed as obligation to local experiences and conditions. And I would probably add to Barkan's argument that another condition is that this be done continually. That is, that collective responsibility is not simply saying we recognize this or we think that it's really bad, but that it represents a permanent orientation of members of communities toward other members of their communities and of difference. Now, all of this sounds very lovely and ideal, and probably a situation that a lot of us in the societies where we live would like to see reached. And we recognize that most of the time it is not reached. Right? Experiences of the past and differing interpretations of experiences of the past, and the fact that people feel threatened by some interpretations of experiences of the past are common. They are sources of dispute in all social environments. Why is this the case? We could argue that this probably derives from some of the contradictions and some of the problems at the core of the idea of collective responsibility. If we want to talk concretely, this is something that I've tried to show in my research and understandings of and dialogue and dispute about the violence of the recent past in Serbia, that two of the really concrete problems, the reasons why you don't see facts turning into shared sentiment on this ideal level that's described by Barkan, is first, because discussion takes place in closed circles among groups of people, mostly in the civil sector, some intellectual groups who are deeply committed to the principle of shared responsibility, and among groups of people, especially those in power, who are deeply opposed to it. Sometimes these people dialogue with one another. Neither of them engages with the public. Second, you see that I've talked about two sets of institutions. I mean, we can call them advocacy institutions for remembrance on the one hand, and institutions associated with perpetrators on the other. You know what's missing here? Are institutions that represent and that are perceived as responding to the consciousness and sentiments that are widely shared among the public, and that are correspondingly the institutions most trusted in different parts of the public. So there we are talking about institutions like education, culture, arts, religion. These are institutions that have been systematically disengaged, and it's probably there that much of the dialogue about responsibility and about what obligations can be derived from the past really take place. Why do they not take place there? Probably the principal reason is fear. And this is another missing element, I think, in the step from knowledge to the development of genuinely shared feelings of responsibility, and that is that in many parts of the public there are feelings of vulnerability that are tied to recognition of facts and to certain interpretations of facts, particularly interpretations of facts as carrying with them obligations to responsibility. And these feelings of vulnerability are either advanced militantly or dismissed as immoral or something like this. That is, there's a lack of understanding for the feelings of vulnerability that are involved in discussions of the past. And what makes this often an intractable problem is that when we talk about obligations, often what's at stake is recognition of grievances that are held by one side. But in most concrete cases, it is not only one side that has grievances, and very often recognition of the grievances of one side is seen as coming at the expense of recognition of grievances on the other side. And that is why these discussions so often become sources of conflict rather than mutual understanding. Now, what I've done here, I've tried to set out some basic frameworks and to raise some problems and questions of collective memory, in questions of collective guilt, in questions of collective responsibility. These are political, empirical, and moral questions that don't lend themselves to easy answers. And I don't have easy answers to offer you to them, but I will look forward to discussing them with you when we have our session